Anyway, we better rip into our sermon today, hadn't we? What I want to share with you today is, essentially, how does our faith survive in the face of adversity or difficulty? How do we do it? What do we need to do? And so I just want to explore that idea. And to do that, we're going to turn to the Hinckley fire, which I'm sure that you have heard of many times. Not. It's a tin pot little town in Minnesota, and it was a tin pot little town back then. But back in 1894, they had a devastating fire that ripped through the town, and many people lost their lives. It devastated 350,000 acres or 1,000 square miles, and that looks like Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bomb. I've seen pictures of that, and that's what the landscape looked like after the fire. And the fire, when it happened, the smoke came through the town. They didn't sort of realise how big this fire was going to be. They didn't have, the technology that we have today. But the two fires managed to converge, and the climate that fire managed to create was like hurricane, tornado forces of wind. And, people gave witnesses of tornadoes of fire and fire leaping above that. And you imagine that coming toward you. And the winds that afternoon had picked up to an extent that the fire and the rapidity in which it took over the town was absolutely amazing and caught the people by surprise. And for various accounts will say 468 died. Many more were injured post-fire. Many lost their lives after the fire from the injuries, and when they went through the town, a lot of dead bodies, mass grave, and they just couldn't bury people with a name against them. And this was the train that managed to rescue the people. The person who was telegraphing the next town down that we needed a train here as soon as possible. And fortunately, it was on time, which was apparently amazing. And when the train arrived, the people hopped on the train, and as the train was driving out, the train driver was seeing people clamouring, wanting to clamour on to the train. But the ferocity of the fire wouldn't allow him to stop, and he knew that those people were going to lose their lives. But he had to save the ones that were on the train, and that's a difficult decision to make. The train was so hot inside, the train driver collapsed twice. The old handbrake, the old lever that go forward, backwards, that was so hot he couldn't even touch it. The carriages, by the time as they were travelling to the next town, were on fire. People were inside it. This gentleman here in the top left-hand corner had to pour a lot. He was one of the unsung heroes of the fire, who helped people to get onto the train and helped people to get off because of the fire around, and the steps were so hot. Now, at that time there was forest around Minnesota and around this tin pot little town, and the main industry was timber. And dry, hot summer, no back burning back then. In fact, it was slash and burn, and that's how they managed to clear farms. But what was interesting about this fire, and why I have highlighted this fire, was because the people, when it came to fire back in 1894, they were very casual about fire, very casual. They were, oh yeah, just another fire. So what? That day, they sort of thought, oh yeah, another fire. It'll be all right. Let's distribute a few barrels of water and a few hoses. At the timber yard, there was 280 million feet of dry timber in that yard. Divide that by 3 to get your metres. That's a lot, isn't it? But they had barrels of water there. The guy telegraphed to the next town and says, we need more hoses. And the hoses that they had there were no bigger than garden hoses. J.W. Stockholm, who worked at the local timber yard, thought, oh, I better go home and see how things are. And he looks out, it'll be all right. We'll just get a couple of barrels of water. That'll help. And a hose to protect his home. I don't know if J.W. Stockholm survived or not. In fact, people were so casual about fire, it took another 2 devastating fires in that area before they think, maybe we need to take fires seriously. When the fire finally got to a point whereby people started to race toward the train, it was because of the local priest ran through the town and said to the people, get out, get out. But for many, it was too late. Some hid in a pit. They didn't make it. Others hid in a swamp in 3 feet of water. They made it. Others raced to the train. And most of them made it, except for the ones who couldn't get there in time. When we are faced with a crisis, and when it comes to a crisis, how prepared are we? When it comes to us as Adventists, and we believe that we're coming up to last days, etc., how well prepared are we? Do we have a couple of barrels of a little bit of a hose there and go, oh yeah, I'm okay. I'm doing all right. I'll lead a pretty good life. I believe in God. Yep. Got my barrels of water here and a hose. I'm okay. How well prepared are we? So I want to have a wee look at Revelation chapter 18, and now, I know Revelation can be a little heavy, and I know as we dive further and further through the book of Revelation, the heavier it gets, and for many people it's extremely difficult to understand. But we'll just look at the first 3 verses, and we'll just have a squiz at that. So after this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory, and called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and destable beast. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury living. Now, this part of Revelation, in the book of Revelation, there's two parts. The first part of Revelation up to chapter 12 looks at the history from different perspectives. The 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, all look at history. The second half is pretty much talking about the judgment against Babylon, judgment against Satan, etc., and the end of the world. Because essentially in verse 21, it says here, the mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. And so that brings an end to Babylon and answers the question back in Revelation 6 of how long? How long? You know, Adventists want to know how long. So that question gets answered there once the angel drops the stone. So now it says here back in the first verses, fallen is Babylon. And then it talks about a whole lot of imagery for the merchants who have got rich and those kings who have got rich. And so we're talking about political power, you're talking about merchants who have become rich through trading, etc. Now, it says here that all nations have drunk of her wine. And so there's a curious question here. And the question is, why would all nations drink of her wine? What does Babylon offer that is so attractive that everyone wants to have a swig out of the cup? What does it offer? Because it must be pretty good if everybody wanted to drink. Now we're talking all nations, all people. Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand even, Europe, Italy, England, all nations, all peoples. What does Babylon offer that is so attractive? You curious about that? You see, Adventists are in conniptions at the moment. They're in conniptions about there's a change of guard over in Rome. And they are looking at Rome and saying, Babylon there, the change of guard, and pretty much the papers and the postings on the internet are pretty much the same as what they were put out 40 years ago with just a change of name. I wonder what that says. Now, maybe Babylon includes that, but it might be just a bit more also. So that as well as. But what is the as well as? An illustration here comes in Daniel chapter 3. Let's come over to Daniel chapter 3. Now, I know you know Daniel 3 really well, so we won't read the whole chapter, and we'll just pick up a wee bit of the story here. And you'll remember that Nebuchadnezzar got everyone out. This is in the kingdom of Babylon. So there is similarities between the kingdom of Babylon. That is a local thing, but in Revelation it takes it into a worldwide concept. All right, but back in Daniel chapter 3, there is something interesting that happens there, that Nebuchadnezzar, who's feeling a little insecure about his kingdom because he had spent an awful lot of money on wasted campaigns and needed to fill the coffers, and his power at this point in time was weakened, and he wanted the loyalty of all his subjects. And so he builds this giant statue. How high was it? Does anyone know? 60 cubits. And how fat was it? 6 cubits. So it was a pretty big statue. What was the name of the statue? That's a trick question. There's no name, is there? I wonder why. He didn't call it Marduk, did he? Didn't call it from the name of any of the gods that Babylon worshipped, did he? So Babylon itself was an empire that had conquered numerous nations in its vicinity. And so what was the practice when they invaded a country, and what did they do with Jerusalem? They took back the creme de la creme of society back to Babylon. They did that with other nations as well. And so Babylon becomes a multicultural society, doesn't it? A pluralistic society. And you're wondering where I'm going with this, aren't you? So he doesn't name the statue, but he wants loyalty. So let's come over to verse 14. And this was at the time when Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had refused to bow down and worship. And we'll go back to verse 13 and give it a little bit of context. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. And so now the king speaks. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" Now, there's an interesting word there. It says, serve my gods or worship, or it could be translated as by worshipping the golden image that I have set up. Now, he didn't name the golden image. This was a multicultural society, a pluralistic society, and therefore they worshipped many different gods. So what Nebuchadnezzar is saying here, I don't care what God you worship so long as you, for today, you bow down and worship this one. You can worship those gods, but you worship this one today. And you can worship yours as well as. Now that's also familiar in Rome with Caesar when they'll come around once a year. And they'll say, we want you to bow down and worship Caesar and give your pledge to loyalty. We don't care about you worshipping your gods. You can worship them, but today you'll bow down and worship this one. So what does us Christians do with that? Well, it's just today, I still believe. Well, this is on pain of death. We don't want to get too dramatic about this now, do we? Do you see how pledging loyalty to our God and to the tenets of the faith of Christianity in the face of, back in Daniel chapter 3, or the times of the Romans, it's going to be awfully difficult, isn't it? You see, you can still worship your gods, but you must worship this one as well as. What would we do? You see, Babylon here, this is about loyalty to many gods. Doesn't matter who you worship, do whatever you want. Which is the essence of going back to when the Tower of Babel started. You remember when the Tower of Babel started, and this was, some say 100 years after the flood, some say a wee bit more. But there were people who are alive who remember the flood, but they still wanted to build a tower. Why? A couple of reasons. One, to get to where? Get to heaven. And the other reason was because they did not believe in God's promise that there would be no flood. So this is about, well, I'm going to find my own way to heaven. I'm going to do it my way. That is at the very core of the essence of the theology of Babylon. You can worship whatever you want, whatever floats your boat. You can do it your way, his way, their way, doesn't matter. But for Babylon, you have to do this. Revelation chapter 18, we had a squiz at that one. And it says that Babylon is fallen. As Adventists, we have tended to look at world events in a certain part of the world which is important. And we need to do that. But by doing that, we actually forget about what is also important, and that is our relationship with God, the supremacy of God, Him being number one, to the exclusion of everything else around us. Let me illustrate this. Secularism. We live in a secularised, civilised society, do we not? Civilised society just simply means to live civilly, which means to be nice, to accept one another, and to get along, and don't break your neighbour's windows or throw stuff at your neighbour's yard or throw rubbish over the fence, that sort of thing, you know. We live in a civilised society. A secularised world in which we live in has the tenet of the separation of church and state. You can worship whatever you want, whatever religion you want, so long as you don't harm anyone in the process. However, the tenets of secularity are beginning to change. And we went to a Church Next conference, and one of the presenters happened to say that in Sweden, which is a very secular society, our church schools have closed down. Why? Because they weren't allowed to have prayer or worship in the school. And you sort of think, well, whatever happened to freedom of religion? So I don't know the answers to those questions. Unfortunately, he didn't expand on that. Now, secular society, since I've been alive, has sort of moved further and further away, and you've got a hard secular society, which means that your faith then becomes privatised behind four walls. Now, one of the other speakers also happened to say that you have to be very careful how you speak to secular people in Europe. They don't want to hear anything about repentance, resurrection, that Jesus died, rose again, there's only one faith. They don't want to hear that. So you've got to find other ways in order to reach. And go, well, hang about, we've got to get there eventually. Isn't our Christian walk, we walk with humility. We believe that Jesus died, rose again. He's the only one who can save. He's the only one who can forgive. There is no other. Jesus is our mediator. There is no other mediator. It matters what we believe. And the secular religion has these tenets, its belief system, in many ways that you could say that it's very orthodox. It is another religion, essentially. Another religion in the sense that these are the tenets of our beliefs. Secularity has views on religion. It has views on what God is or who He is, and that it must be extricated from society. But it also has broader views about humanity, humanism, and all that sort of thing. And these become their tenets. As secularism has grown, those tenets have become much more fixed to the point that you now have to abide by them. Sweden can't worship. You can't have worship in school, and you can't have prayer in school. In Victoria, in Australia, you cannot pray for certain groups of people. You now have the state starting to do theology, but yet they have their own tenets of faith that you're not allowed to contradict. Now, if we were to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 1, we get to the nub of what goes on with the heart. Deuteronomy chapter 1, and you may recall that this is Moses' farewell address. In all my years that I've been alive, and in the 40 years or so that I've been with you, this is my counsel to you. And so Deuteronomy just simply means the second law. And that's what Deuteronomy stands for. And so Moses gives a series of about 7 sermons. And the first one, in chapter 1, he recounts the history of the Jews. And he comes up with something that is really fascinating about the Jews at the time. And he recounts the time in Numbers when they were about to go into Canaan, and God says to them, I will go before you. Okay. What does that mean? It means that God will go before you. Oh, okay. But we'll send spies anyway. So they sent off spies. After all, that's what you do in a military campaign. You send people to go before you because, hey, let's face it, they're going to die first rather than me. All right, so a bit of a selfish intent there. So you send them off and they can get speared and they can give us a report. Anyway, as you know, they came back, and what was their report? What was about the giants? Sorry, a bit louder. Come on, don't be shy. What was that about the giants? They're too big. We couldn't possibly take over that, even though that took 2 people to carry a bunch of grapes. A little bit different than the ones you get in Woolworths, in a little wee bag now that you put in the trolley. But it took 2 people to carry grapes back. But there were giants. And all of a sudden, their faith withered. As Moses recounts the story, he says something interesting here. Verse 26. And he says here, yet you would not go up, but you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God, and you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us and he brought us out of the land of Egypt to give us into the hand of the Amorites. Now, as he, just in the previous verses, he recounted the story of going into sending the spies into Canaan. I'll go before you. But because the spies came back, the people said, you hate us. They said this about God, you hate us. Do you find that stunning? Hang on. How did I bring you out of Egypt? There were how many plagues? 10. Brought you through the Red Sea. I fed you. There was a pillar. And then you say, you hate me? Do you find that odd? What's it saying here is that the people did not believe God. They believed in God, but they did not believe that God had their back. You're not with me. You don't have my back. As you're sitting here today, every one of us believes in God, but do you believe that God has your back? What if everything was ripped away from you? Does God have your back? Do you believe that God has your back? And this is for secularism. Even though we say that it is a godless society, most people in a secular society believe in God. But they don't believe that God has your back. Interesting, isn't it? Most people still believe in God, or some sort of God, but what does that look like? And for Babylon, this is essentially at the very core of what it means to Babylon, and this is what people drink out of. All the nations drink of. Every one of them is a do-it-yourself religion. I'll do it my way. I'll believe in what I want to believe. I'll believe in the God that I want. And people will construct that however they want in their own eyes and in their own way. The do-it-yourself religion, self-sufficiency, the great Protestant tradition, to be self-sufficient, to do it my way. That is the essence of Babylon. To drink out of that cup is to drink the wine that says, you know what, I'll do it my way. I'll construct the God that I want. In Babylon, they had all these other gods that they worshipped, that they constructed, they carved out. This is the God that we want, this one. Another nation, this is the God that we want. Fine, you have that God, but you'll believe this. Secularism. You can believe whatever you want, but you must believe in the tenets of secularity. Do you believe today that God has your back? No matter what happens in this world, do you believe that God will bring you through? He promises that in Scripture. We know it, we hear it, but do we believe it? Do we live it? Just in closing, Joseph, a moving story, Joseph Bates. And you remember part of his story. He was a sea captain, and his wife, whose name is Prudence, gives him a Bible, and while he was out at sea on his last voyage, he reads it. He became converted. And this was before 1844, and for those of you who remember, you'll remember that it was William Miller and many others who were preaching that Jesus would initially come back in 1843, and then they shifted to 1844. But there are other people who were also preaching that in England and also in Europe about 1844, that we often forget about. And Joseph Bates believed that Jesus was going to come back in 1844. In fact, he believed it so much that he sold his farm. By the time he retired as a sea captain, he was quite wealthy and well off. And he sold his farm for $4,500 at the time, which was a princely sum of money. And he gave it to the cause. And post 1844 or after 1844, will you imagine what it would have been like for him on October 22? Sitting there, still looking all day, waiting. Nothing. You spent your whole life, your life savings and everything. And by the time midnight came that day, nothing happened. What will that do to your faith? Has God got his back? What did Joseph Bates do? Many others left. I didn't really believe anyway. Did Joseph Bates believe that God had his back? Anyway, there was a scene in the movie Tell the World, and they were sitting there, and just a little bit after 1844, they didn't really quite know how the church was going to, I'm talking broadly here, I'm not talking so much of the Adventist church as such at this point, because it hadn't formed. But they're trying to formulate their beliefs at this time, and what happened in 1844, where did it all go wrong? And so Alan Harmon was just started to speak there, and Joseph Bates was sitting at the table and with Prudence there, and he's reading letters there, and he's saying, this Alan Harmon, she's going around preaching, and Prudence asked, do you believe in her? And I said, well, she's had visions. And visions were one of the things that the post-Millerites refused. That was one of the markers of saying, nah, you don't believe them if they have visions. So that was one of the hallmarks, but she has visions. So that kind of wrote her off in Joseph Bates' mind at that time. And he said, have you met her? Our paths will cross. Anyway, it came to tea time. What have we got to eat for tea, dear? Well, I need some cups of flour. And he goes to the local store and he hands over one coin. And he said, I'd like as much flour as that coin will buy. And the bloke behind the counter gives him the flour, goes home. His wife cooks it up there, and he says to her, in a little bit of exasperation, do we not have any butter or apple jam or raspberry jam with this? Nope, not unless you bought it at the store, she said. Nothing. And he said to her, well, you know what? I spent my last coin at the shop buying this flour. I spent the last coin in buying that flour. How would your faith be if you were sitting at that table? You spend your last coin, you got no food, and I love my food. You got nothing. And Prudence and exasperation recounts, we used to have a farm. We've lost our farm, we lost our son to the sea, and now we have no money. Have you nothing else to offer? And to a bloke sitting at the table, a sea captain, said, we'll need to pray about it. have you nothing else to offer? Do you believe that God has your back at this time? Joseph Bates did. Next day he goes to the store. And the bloke at the store, when he enters the store, in the film, there's a bloke who mocks him. Oh, where's Jesus, Joseph? Did he go that way? Oh, no, he must have gone this way, and mocks him. Pretty hard to take. Has God got your back? He goes to the counter, and the bloke behind the counter says to him, I have a letter for you. Brings the letter over, and Joseph pushes the letter back. He says, because you had to pay 5 cents in order to retrieve the letter. I've got no money. He said, oh, it's all right, just open it. I can't. Pushes it back, and so the letter sort of goes kind of back and forth. And anyway, eventually he gets to the point and says, well, to the bloke behind the counter, you open it. Opens up the letter. There's a handwritten note there. And it just says, God bless your ministry. And there was an undisclosed sum of money in that envelope that allowed him to buy food for the family just in time. And you just go, wow. You know, Joseph Bates, at a time when things were so low, nothing else to eat, God was there. For the Israelites, when they went through the experience of the Red Sea, God feeding them, they never really believed that God was there with them, even though the pillar was there. When it comes for us, when we are standing there with our barrels of water and with a hose, God gives us a massive fire hydrant. Massive, with limitless amounts of water. Not just a limp little garden hose. He gives us the ability to face crises. But we have to know and believe that God has our back, which is the antithesis of self-sufficiency and a do-it-yourself religion that very much appeals to the heart, because the heart says, I want to do it my way. But I want to say to you today, no matter what faces us, and we're coming toward the end of the world, the Bible says that, God has your back and He has my back. And we can have absolute assurance. Why? Because Jesus rose and died and rose again, sorry.